Okay, on to handout 5. We are still subtracting numbers, and now we're moving on to rational numbers, so that will include decimals and fractions. So if we think about the process for subtracting fractions, I'm going to just put an F there. We find the least common multiple, least common denominator, and then we, subtract and then keep the numerator. For decimals, the most important thing is we have to line them up. Line up decimal. This is supposed to say decimal. And then big number on top. And that's going to be really important here. Okay, so when we subtract, we will use the additive inverse to add the opposite. So remember, that basically means that a number like 7 added to its opposite is 0. So that's why we're able to change subtraction to addition and change the sign. So we're going to rewrite the problem to add the opposite. And then we follow the rules of addition. So if you recall from last lesson, you can I just like to go add the opposite, and then I have 7 plus -16. And then I go add the opposite. -8 plus -11 is -19. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video, and then you do the rest. Okay, so if you check your answers, we got -15 because we added the opposite there. Add the opposite here, -8. Add the opposite, -14. So then you follow the rules of addition. Down here, put a big plus sign there. It's 12. Plus sign there, 25. Add the opposite here, same thing, but now we have a -9 and a 14. And I'm outside, it's a little windy. Add the opposite, and we have a -16 and a +7. Add the opposite, so -11 is the answer. So down here, same rule, we're going to rewrite it to add the opposite. So you have add the opposite. Now, here's the tricky thing, is these you really can't do in your head. You got to be careful, because you might try to do like 5 minus 3 and then do 6 minus 4. And that's not how it should be. So you got to put the bigger number, or the absolute value on top. And so then we got 13 here and a 5 here. And so we end up with 1.8. And we take the sign of the bigger number, which is 6.3. So you go ahead and do that first row and then check back. Okay, you should be able to read my answers. I put the add the opposite on these problems up here. So this was 2 negatives, so we add them together, keep the sign. 2 negatives, add them together, keep the sign. Subtract these, take the sign of the bigger number, add them together, keep the sign. So go ahead and pause it if you need more time to look at it, and then go on down below, making sure you're putting the big number on top if you go to subtract. Okay, we got 9 here, add the opposite. So 2 positives, add the opposite, 2 positives, add the opposite. So you subtract, take the sign of the bigger number, add the opposite, subtract, take the sign of the bigger number, add the opposite, subtract, take the sign of the bigger number. Again, pause it if you need more time to look at them and figure out what you did wrong. And then we're going to go on to the back. And it's the same thing with whole numbers, decimals, and fractions. The process is always the same. It's just more steps with the fraction. So again, we're going to add the opposite. This gets a little bit tricky because sometimes, in the beginning they have common denominators, but after that, sometimes, I guess you do. I was going to say you don't know which one is bigger or smaller sometimes, but it should work out. So on these, we're going, in this one you might be able to look and know that you're doing a small number minus a big number. So you know it's going to be negative, and 4 minus 3 is 1. Okay, when you get to having more than one negative, I always go add the opposite. So now I know it's two negatives. So I'm actually going to put them together. So we have negative 6 over 6, which equals negative 1. And this negative sign here is only negative for one of the numbers. It doesn't matter which one. So I just put it on the top. But you don't put it twice. Okay, next one is a negative and a negative. And so we're going to actually add them together. So we're going to have negative 1 and 1, negative 4, 1 and 4/4, which 4/4 equals 2. So it's negative 2. Next one, add the opposite. So we have negative 12/10. Ooh, that did not turn out right. That's a 12. And then when you reduce it, you get negative 1 and 1/5. Next one, add the opposite. So we have a positive and a negative. So you're going to subtract. So you have to do the 3 1/8 minus that. And so I know that that's 1 and the sign of the bigger number. You always have to remember the sign of the bigger number. Okay, so you go ahead and do the rest of them. And I'm going to add the opposite here. So I'm going to subtract 2/3 minus 1/3, sign of the bigger number. Add the opposite. So I'm going to actually add them and get 10/8, which equals 1 and 1/4 in the end. This one, add the opposite. So I get 6/12, which equals 1/2. Add the opposite. So I have a negative and a positive. So I subtract and take the sign of the bigger number. All right. Down below are probably be your least favorite. You have to find a common denominator, and then you add the opposite. I'm just going to abbreviate. So first thing we do is find a common denominator. So I'm going to use 6 times by 2, and we get 4. Then you have to remember to add the opposite. So we have a negative plus a negative. So we know we add them and get negative 5, 6. That's a negative 5. Okay, so you go ahead and try the rest of them. Okay, so the second one here, we had, we should have added the opposite. And so let's see. Oh yeah, negative 6. And so you have a 5 minus 6 on top, so negative 1. Next one, we would add the opposite, and the 12 is the common denominator. So you just do 3 plus 8 and bring down your 1. This next one, I went ahead and found common denominators down below. I used 10, and then I have a negative minus a negative, and we're going to add the opposite. We never change that first number. And so we have a negative plus a positive. So this is probably one that's the most tricky, because I'm going to put the 8/10 down here, because that's the smaller number. So since it's a negative and a positive, we actually have to subtract. So we have to borrow, make that a 0, and make this 15, because 10 plus 5 is 15. And then we subtract, we get 7/10. And the sign of the bigger number is negative 1.5, so it is negative. And remember, you could change 1.5 into 3/2. So if you wanted to do that, I will do it down here. You could have done negative 3/2, and then you would have had change it out of 10, and that would have been 15. And then you would have had 4/5. Make that out of 10. And then you would have been left with that 7/8 or 7/10 there, if that's easier for you. Okay.